Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my full review, the digitally digested segment, for the Sony Cyber-shot RX10 Mark III. Priced at $1,500 US, you're looking at the most expensive bridge-style camera ever made, but without hesitation also the best. And I say that because in my experience, I really haven't found a situation where I have not been able to cover at least what I want to shoot with this device. And it is hybrid in every sense of the word, because we've got a fixed 24 to 600 millimeter piece of Carl Zeiss glass. Yes, it is now a variable aperture lens, unlike the first or second generation, matched with Sony's now, I would say, acclaimed 1-inch sensor that has become the backbone of the entire RX Cyber-shot lineup, whether we're talking about the original RX10, the Mark II, the RX100, all the way up to the current RX100 Mark IV. This is really an incredible sensor, and Sony certainly has put it into a lot of different forms. And this happens to be my favorite, and that's because I really have not found a situation where I can't cover what I'm trying to shoot or record when it comes to video with this digital imaging device. Now, at $1,500, you have a lot of options in the camera world. Clearly, you can go interchangeable. Sony, the a6300, I did a comparison between this camera and that is definitely, when it comes to pure imaging quality, superior. It's got an APS-C sensor. Here we're dealing with a 1-inch stack sensor that is not in the same league. It is a smaller sensor, and a lot comes with, a smaller sensor. But in terms of having a single package that can do basically anything that I think most consumers are after, is exactly what the RX10 Mark III represents. Now, some will look at the RX10 Mark III and say, well, because Sony removed the neutral density filter that was in the first and second generation of this camera, they did a disservice to themselves, because part of what videographers loved about the first and second RX10 was that it had a three-stage or three different level neutral density filter built in. And I understand exactly where they're coming from. If you are shooting strictly video, that is something that is great to have built into the camera. And I would have liked to have seen that incorporated here in the third gen RX10. In the same vein, I think that if you're like me, and one of your biggest, or rather the thing that really held me back from purchasing and keeping an RX10 Mark I or II, was its focal range being limited to 18 to 200 millimeters. Granted, it did have a fixed aperture, which again now is variable, but topping out at f4, which is still very good. Then Sony has granted your wish with this camera, and you're going to pay for it, no doubt about it. But I think it's a price that is completely warranted, because there is nothing else on the market that can achieve what this camera can in one package. Now, neutral density filter aside, let's get right into what this thing can do. The only thing that I wish was here, and again, neutral density filter aside, which I can live without, because I'm not, using this strictly for video, but it does serve as a great B cam for video, and for many it'll be an A cam for video, because the video it produces is fantastic. I would have liked to have seen a hybrid autofocus system, something like we have in the a6000. I wouldn't expect them to incorporate the competency of the a6300, but maybe what, again, existed in the a6000, having both, contrast and phase detection points, 179 and change, that would have been great on here, because after all, with a lens like this, which, by the way, the lens is tack sharp, I would say really across the range, which is what really makes this impressive. Even at the end of this 600 millimeter lens, I'm still getting great results. And that's not something I necessarily expected, but I knew that if Sony was going to make the chief upgrading or upgrade factor of this model, that we were getting a 25 times lens here, which we are, that it would really need to deliver throughout the entire range, and it does. When I compare this to my experience with Panasonic's FZ1000, which was a great camera and now is an incredible value because it's been on the market for 2 years, and you can find it for 600, in change, maybe even less if you're interested in the used market. That tops out at 400 millimeters, has a fully articulating display, but it just doesn't have the weather sealing, the build quality, and overall capability that you will get out of the RX10 Mark III. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be worth the price of admission for every user out there, but for me personally, I look at a camera like this and I can fit it in a very compact bag. Yes, it's not pocketable, clearly, but a compact bag. And I'm not worried about, did I bring the right lenses with me? Granted, this is not for shooting in the dark because it's a 1-inch sensor paired, with a variable aperture, very long piece of glass, but it still is competent in just about every situation. The EVF, very good, basically the same one you're getting on the A6300, and that is a great thing. Only key difference is that it doesn't have the 120 frame rate switch that the A6300 does. So otherwise, the OLED EVF in here is phenomenal. You've got a hot shoe on the top. The flash really can be bounced and positioned as you would like in order to, spread light as needed or fill light as needed. Power on time, almost instant. And the autofocus system, despite leaning just on contrast, is very competent. You also have access to the Play Memories application store, which is another great added feature, which has been around for a while now. This is certainly not the first camera to have it, but having something like the time-lapse application, I know Sony even pushed out an additional update the other day. I forget what the app was. I think it was a retouching app. The fact that they're still keeping that ecosystem alive is a good sign. It shows that consumers still use it, and quite frankly, something like the time-lapse app, which Panasonic, other manufacturers give you for free out of the box, it isn't necessarily there with everybody else. In terms of the aperture ring that you see right here, just like on previous gen models, we have the ability to turn the click on or off. So, whether you're shooting stills and you want to feel that tactile step, you've got it. Shooting video, switch it off. It's smooth as butter, not going to be incorporated into the audio that the camera captures, which, by the way, is very good for onboard audio. You've got the stereo microphone array right there, and it is solid. In terms of hooking up external audio, you have that ability right here on the left side of the camera. We have both a mic and headphone jack, so if that's something you're concerned about, don't be. And then when it comes to additional ports, we have HDMI out, as well as Sony's multi-port, which is really their method for charging the camera. It's a micro USB port. And that would be my next biggest pet peeve with this camera, but this applies to all camera manufacturers. I would really love to see rapid charging incorporated into cameras at this point. Granted, I don't even charge my batteries on body. I have a dedicated external charger, and quite frankly, if you own something like this, I highly recommend picking up an external charger to handle your battery charging, because to try to do one at a time is going to really be a tremendous pain, and you're going to want to get extra batteries, and thankfully they're not expensive because these batteries have been on the market for a long time. So I definitely recommend extra batteries. Wish Sony would invest a little bit, as well as every other manufacturer, this isn't just a Sony problem, in making the quick charging we've come to expect, enjoy from our smartphones, get that incorporated into cameras. There really isn't a good excuse for that other than cutting cost or corners. As you can see, you can also use this ring to manually zoom as opposed to using the trigger right here. It's really a matter of personal preference, what you want to use. Tremendous amount of customization here on the buttons that are available to you. Another nice advantage is that unlike the A6300, where the video record button is where it historically is on Sony cameras, which has always been a point of contention. For those of you unaware, it's located on the right-hand side of the grip. Here it's where it should be. It's right, easily accessible in the center of the body. You're not going to wobble or shake going to stop or start recording. I mentioned we have a stacked sensor design here, basically the same thing found in the RX100 Mark IV, a camera that for me is one of my go-tos. It's a favorite of mine. Granted, the Panasonic ZS100 does give it a run for the money for considerably less. It is a little bit larger. Don't want to go too far off topic, but we have HFR. So we've got high-speed recording now, so some slow-mo. This already existed. 240 frames per second is really as far as you're going to want to push this. Anything beyond that, the quality is going to get really degraded, even though Sony's going to claim that it's still HD. The artifacting that you'll see, or artifacts, will tell you otherwise. But you can shoot at 120 frames per second on here, just like the A6300 in 1080p, and that does put out some really nice slow motion footage without any true degradation like you get into when you start to step up to the 240, 480, or shall I say forbid the 960 frames per second. The LCD screen is great. A lot of people wish that there was a touch screen involved here. I personally can live without it. Would I be happy if they granted it to us? Of course, but for me personally, I would be more interested if the LCD could finally fully articulate and come out rather than just give us low and high angles. That to me would be of more interest. Just to flip around the side, kind of like the Panasonic FZ1000, that would actually be of more interest to me than a touchscreen, believe it or not. But let's take a dive into the menu system. I'm going to go to auto because we're in HFR. Let me show you what HFR has to say in terms of what you can do right now. You can see if I hit that center button, it activates the ability to actually do that 3-second recording at 200 frames per second, which I find to be cumbersome, quite frankly. It's just something that, I wish we had more time with, but that's how Sony has designed this. And you can see in terms of HFR settings, these are the options we have. 60p at 50 megs a second. You can, of course, take that to 480 or 960. And again, I don't recommend doing that. You can schedule whether you want it to be quality priority based or the length shoot time priority based. And of course, that comes at a cost. So essentially, with the quality priority, you're looking at 8 seconds. So 3 seconds at 240 frames per second becomes an 8-second clip. If you go to shoot time priority, you'll get 16 seconds, twice the amount of time, basically, with, again, a cost at the quality of the video that you're shooting. If I go back into the menu there, that is the EVF sensor detecting that I'm using it, even though I'm not because I reached across. I want to take you into some regular settings. So let's go to auto. I'm not saying everybody lives in auto, but it's safe to assume that, like most Cyber-shots, Sony has designed this camera for both audiences, the one that is going to live in the auto mode, as well as those of you that want to take advantage of every manual capability that this beast has to offer. So jumping into the menu here, first and foremost, let's start with the image size. Of course, 20 megapixel sensor. You can play with the actual megapixel count. After all, this camera is all about cropping, at least for me, because that extends the reach of this 600 millimeter piece of glass even, farther. We're not just dealing with 600 millimeters once you enable clear image zoom. Forget about the digital zoom as well. Your aspect ratio 3:2, but you can play around with that. It's all up to you what you want to shoot in. The quality, again, the raw JPEG combo for those of you that have to have the best of both worlds. That's what I recommend. And then extra fine, which quite frankly, in my experience with this camera, has been very good so far. The dual recording feature exists here. It has in the past, and it's fine. It's not really something that I tend to use, but I know some of you out there do. When it comes to file formats with video, you've got several different options. This is also not new to any Sony users out there. XAVCS is what you'll be shooting in, or the container for 4K video. You can step down to XAVCS HD as well, and then AVC HD for traditional HD recordings that don't have as high a bit rate, and then MP4 for sharing, basically in the smallest file container possible, but also with the least quality. Again, going back to the menu. As we move along here, I already touched on, here are your bit rates, 30p and 4K, you're getting 100. You can drop it down to 60. You can also, of course, go for 24. A lot of you are more into the 24p cinematic, and I understand exactly why. And again, you can defer to what bit rate you'd like to have there. Also, nothing new that you haven't seen before. The dual video recording right there, the HFR settings we were in before. Beyond that, your drive mode. The autofocus on here, I have to say, is very good. Even though I noted earlier that I would have loved to have seen this camera have some contrast and phase detection points on sensor, we'll probably see that in the next generation. I mean, again, for those of you that think this is a minor upgrade by putting a whole new lens that is, more than twice the reach of what was existing on the first two generations, I see this as a gamble and a risk-taking position that Sony took on, and I respect that. It's pushing the envelope. I don't see it as a lose-lose, as many videographers and some photographers see. I see it as a complete opposite. But again, that's why we're all entitled to our own opinion and preference on what gear we want to use and what suits our personal needs, depending on what we're shooting. When it comes to everything else, it's as expected. You have Sony's iFocus system, and really the overall quality of the contrast-based autofocus system here is good. And the burst mode, I think it caps out at, I believe it's 14 or 16 frames. I think it's 14. I haven't been disappointed at all. I've done a lot of wildlife shooting with this down in Georgia, and I was really impressed with my results, again, even at 600 millimeters, and not even necessarily with the best lighting conditions. So that says a lot about what this camera can do with that f2.4 to f4 range on the variable aperture lens that it has. The Zeiss piece of glass here is stunning, and that's the key. That's what Sony tends to focus on. If they're going to make a change, they're going to do it right, and in my opinion, the lens here is just as important as the sensor, and they have done exactly that, as the camera, is trying to save power on me and turning the menu off as I go through things for all of you. But everything else that you'd expect to see here is here. Picture effects, profiles, these are mostly gimmicks in my opinion. The focus magnifier, clearly a good thing to use if you need it. Center lock on autofocus, the smile and face detection, more of a gimmick, but it does work unless you have an irregular shaped head. And that's not an insult to anyone, but I've seen it not lock on to things, and I've seen it think things are heads that aren't heads. So enough said with that. Soft skin effect, the auto object framing, auto mode, you can switch that between the auto intelligent and the superior auto. It's really, this has been around forever with Sony. This is not a new thing by any means of the imagination. Steady shot is something you can turn on while shooting 4K video, but you will not be able to use anything other than standard. Intelligent active and active are reserved for traditional 1080p video. You're not going to get that with 4K. It simply isn't an option at this stage. Maybe somewhere down the road, but as it stands right now, that is not a capability of this camera. Wind noise reduction, it's off right now. I can assure you it does make a difference when you turn it on. In terms of settings, I'm just going to go through them very quickly. Zebra, you need it. We all know this. Manual focus assist. Everything is there. Grid lines. This is a machine that's built to do everything. And at $1,500, it should be able to. So whether we're talking about still or video, you've got it. You can see I have the digital zoom enabled, and that's because, quite frankly, the 1-inch sensor does afford quite a bit of range with that digital zoom before things get gross, is what I'll say, before the watercolor effect really presents itself in the crop of the image. So if you're someone that likes to shoot moon, any sort of star-related stuff, you're going to be happy with this camera on a tripod using a remote, because you're going to get really impressive capability, something that normally I would have had to lean on an interchangeable lens camera. And that's kind of the moral of the story with the RX10 Mark III, is that almost everything that I can do with this camera, traditionally I would have needed, an interchangeable lens camera and a barrage of lenses. Now I don't need that. Of course, I can still pull out my A7R Mark II, bring out the glass. Same applies to my A6300, but I don't have to. And that's what I love about this camera. And it's really, of course, a matter of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. For me, the functionality and practicality of the RX10 Mark III is what makes it a winner. Someone who thinks the neutral density filter not being there and doesn't want to have to screw neutral density filters onto the thread of the front of the camera, I don't know what to say to them other than big deal. I'm sorry. For me, it's not a game breaker, but I understand for those of you that it is, because we did have a standard set that was removed in favor of giving us extra reach. But that's just what it is. Control of the focus ring, zoom ring, because again, more customization, the movie button, the wheel lock, your Wi-Fi and NFC connectivity. Again, Play Memory Store is there. You can buy as well as download free applications to just take your photography to another level. But really learning how to use the camera is going to be the best way to do that. The applications are just a nice touch. And again, my favorite is the time-lapse app because it's just become more refined over the years. It's the most mature and practical of the entire Play Memory Store, beyond the remote control of the camera, the remote shutter, which is another nice one, which I haven't demoed, and I could if all of you were interested in it. But I think it's really more about determining whether or not this camera is right for you. When it comes to playback, everything's standard there. And then finally, settings. If you're out in bright conditions, you're going to want to crank up the brightness on the actual monitor because it's going to get difficult. But that's why you've got this fantastic OLED EVF, and you can just also bring up the brightness in the viewfinder. I don't really find lag or anything of that nature to be an issue in the EVF. Also, the silent shutter on here is a beautiful thing, but that's been around now for a while, so I'm not really telling you anything new about the RX lineup. It all began with the RX1, the silent shutter, and boy, everybody wants to be part of that club, and for good reason. You don't want to disturb your subject. You want to be discreet. Hopefully you're not being a creep, but you know what I'm saying. Better to not have the shutter sound if you don't need it, and with a camera like this, you don't. Of course, with the $3,000 A7S Mark II or $3,200 A7R Mark II, you also have a silent shutter. Same applies to the A6300, but you will need to bring that bag of lenses unless you really do live in a prime world where you shoot simply with a 50. That's what it comes down to. Your volume settings can be tweaked here. Everything can be tweaked, essentially. There's really nothing that Sony has left out. And for people that complain about the menu system, those are predominantly people that have not shot with Sony cameras in the past and are migrating from Nikon, Canon, Panasonic. So I feel like while there are valid points to be made for how intuitive Sony's menu system breaks down, in the same vein, every camera manufacturer has their own idiosyncrasies when it comes to their menu layout, and anyone coming from one manufacturer to another is going to have complaints about how things are laid out and how convenient it is to get to the actual functions they would like to be using. The HFR is a perfect example on here where I will critique Sony. They have made that convoluted. I mean, to just allow us to shoot the 240 frames per second by simply just hitting the movie button without having to go in and out of standby, I really don't see why that's a necessity, but it is part of how the camera works. Love it or hate it, that's what it is. But you can always default to the 120 frames per second, and then you don't have that problem at all. I'm trying to think of what else I haven't covered. I mean, in terms of menu diving, we've done it. The grip, it's a heavy camera. What can I tell you? You've got a 24 to 600 35 millimeter equivalent piece of Zeiss glass on here. So you're not going to expect it to be a lightweight. But when you compare it again to the gear bag that I would need to tote in order to do what this can, both on the wide and telephoto end of the lens, this really isn't a heavy camera to carry around. And it's kind of made me want to break out my old RX1, which is still a gem, and just have this and the RX1 in tandem and leave my A7R Mark II at home. And that's because I feel like I have the best of both worlds there, even if the RX1 has shortcomings. Let's remember it's from 2012. It's not exactly a new camera. By the way, a steal in the used market for those of you looking for something of that nature. A fantastic 35mm full frame fixed lens camera. No 4K video, but amazing stills still to this date. But beyond that, the readout at the top, a great thing to have. Oddly enough, the RX10 line is the only Sony camera outside of A-mount that incorporates that. None of the E-mount based models do, simply because of, I believe, the actual form factor, the size, the footprint. But Sony, it's just another good thing to have. Not necessary, of course. We've got all the info on screen inside the EVF everywhere you look, but not bad to have that information there to populate your aperture, everything, the number of shots you have left on your SD card. I've been shooting predominantly with a 512 gig Kingston SD card, and even though it doesn't have the class rating necessary for 4K video, it's what I'm using right now to record this, and it's a dream to use. Kingston sent those to me for review, and I still can't thank them enough because those are phenomenal cards, and even faster cards are coming out. Hopefully I'll be reviewing them because as long as we don't have a USB 3.0 or 3.1 connection, it's still going to be quickest to just pop out your SD card and throw it into whatever you want to transfer the images to, even though, of course, you can use NFC and Wi-Fi. I find that to be more of a novelty than a realistic method of file transfer. I mean, forget about video transfer. So Wi-Fi and NFC, I wish all manufacturers would upgrade, give us better chipsets, and make it more of a viable way to offload things. I mean, the promise of things like iFi back in the day, they really never materialized, even though the cameras have everything built in to do it. That's still not clearly a focus on this camera or any other on the market, so it's not just a Sony thing. But when it comes down to the still video capability that you get out of this, there's nothing else like it on the market. And even if we took away the Zeiss branding, the quality, performance of this lens, when I put it next to images I've shot in the past with the FZ1000, this thing is sharper at every part of its range. So even if I were just to compare it up to 400 millimeters, the RX10 Mark III kills the Panasonic. Is it a tremendous margin? No, but it's definitely noteworthy, and it should be at this price. I mean, $1,500 versus, as I said before, around $600. It should be able to beat everything else out there, and it does. And after all, the FZ1000 is a 2-year-old piece of hardware. In terms of the Nikon offering that I think reaches out to 500 millimeters that's rolling out this month, I still don't see it to be a true competitor. I think the ergonomics are worse. The weather sealing here is another great element, and I have tested it. I haven't dunked this in water, but I've used it in rain. No issues, no errors, so no overheating with video. And then you also do have a lock button here for your focus, very similar to what you'd find on Sony's 70-200 G lens, well, any of their telephoto lenses. So they have taken into account that you're spending $1,500 and you need to feel reassured that you really are getting a piece of hardware that isn't just, the latest update, but rather really worth your hard-earned money. And I can say that, at least for me, in my experience so far, the RX10 Mark III does check all of the boxes. It delivers in every arena. Whether I'm wide or at that telephoto end, I'm getting great results, and I'm doing it with one piece of hardware. And to those of you that's not relevant, it's not relevant, and I understand that completely. Don't bother leaving comments. I mean, if you made it this far, you're probably not going to bother leaving the comments, and if you didn't make it this far, those people are going to leave comments telling me that, well, for $1,500 I could buy X, Y, or Z. Of course you could. This camera is about convenience and having everything in a single package. And if that wasn't obvious from the onset, well, then I don't know what to tell you. I'm not going to be rude about it, that's for sure. The RX10 Mark III is a winner. It'll eventually come down in price, as does everything in this world, at least when it's tech-related or automobile for the most part. So keep that in mind. Right now it's in short supply. Some retailers are gouging. I think it's disgusting, but it's the nature of the business when natural disasters lead to, component shortages like Sony is facing right now after the earthquake in Japan that has left them kind of, picking up the pieces and trying to get back on their roadmap for the balance of this year. But easily right now, the RX10 Mark III, best bridge camera ever made. And again, in my opinion, you really can't go wrong with this if you're after a bridge style camera with great image quality and a lens that is not going to present obstacles, but rather, I hate to say bridge, I'm not trying to be cute, but give you the capability to be as creative as you'd like to be. Also great on the macro end, something I didn't mention through the course of this review. So RX10 Mark III is a winner, folks, and if you're hesitant or wondering whether or not it's worth your hard-earned money, it all comes down to whether or not you really want to carry around a bag, an entire gear bag, rather than just a few extra batteries. I would say 4 is a good number if you're going away on any sort of trip, holiday, or covering an event with it. And then, of course, how you want to build it out is up to you, because it does have that hot shoe and a line in for microphone, line out for monitoring. So versatility is the RX10 Mark III's name of the game. And again, for the ND filter, get an ND filter and attach it. I know it's not what a lot of people want to hear with the price bump up, but try to realize that throwing this lens on here and making it actually work as well as Sony did is not a minor upgrade, but in many cases, an entirely different RX10 altogether, which is why I think it still leaves a place for the RX10 Mark I and Mark II, and that's why production has not ceased on those models. Forget that they're both less expensive. And if you don't need the extra reach, that's definitely the direction you should be going in, or an FZ1000. But again, the FZ1000, in my opinion, does not live up to the overall quality of the original RX10 Mark I. Forget the Mark II, of course, where we did get UHD. No video bump, or rather lens bump on zooming with this either. And that was a big complaint for many RX10 Mark II users. But overall, that rounds out the full review. Hope you enjoyed my input and experience, my feedback with this great piece of kit. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.